And we are live. Hi, my name is Dave. I will be your host for tonight's event, which is happening. I'm in the camera store, and our special guest is all the way in Toronto, but we'll get to him in a moment. But it's Mastering Portraits with Capture One, from base edits to stunning finishes. Now, I would like to thank Capture One for making this happen. And in the chat, we do have Laura from Capture One, who's going to be answering all of your questions there. And because this is a Capture One event, we are having a very big promotion on this. I mean, it's 50% off. You'll be able to get Capture One for $200. This is a fantastic deal for this. And after you watch this presentation, you're going to see why Capture One is so important in your workflow, or what it should be. So check out the Camera Store website for that promo there. Now, behind the scenes, we do have a bunch of stuff going on. We do have Gary and May, who are working behind the scenes here to make sure that this whole thing goes off without a hitch. And it was a little dicey for a little bit there. But we were doing okay there, so we're happy there. But if something does happen technically, just stay tuned. We'll try and address it as quickly as possible. But for the most part, these go off without a hitch. So what I do like about these live streams is the ability to interact with everybody here. So I will be monitoring the chat, and if there's any questions going on, if Laura's not answering them, I'll do what I can. But I'm also going to put a bunch of questions together at the end of the show to ask our special guest here. Now, and if you're not comfortable actually being in the chat, you can simply email myself, Dave at thecamerastore.com, or Evelyn, Evelyn at thecamerastore.com, and both of us will help out and make this work. So if you are not already familiar with our guest tonight, Giancarlo Pawelec is a Toronto-based photographer with a diverse background in the arts, ranging from oil paintings to graffiti during his rebellious teenage years. We'll ask him more about that before we get too far. Finding a true passion in photography with a self-taught career spanning 2 decades. How old is this guy? He has become an expert in his field. Giancarlo has built an impressive clientele that includes esteemed brands such as Jaguar, Land Rover, Porsche, Ford, Mark Anthony Cosmetics, and Kenneth Cole, along with various leading publications. So without further ado, let's bring him on. Giancarlo, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know it's past your bedtime there in Toronto. You got 2 hours on us here.
It is. But thank you for having me. That's absolutely awesome. I appreciate it.
So you are a working pro. You've got all kinds of stuff on the go, and you are a Capture One expert.
I absolutely, I am. I've been using it for quite some time, so this is a privilege to actually be sharing, be able to share my knowledge.
That's very cool. So what can we expect tonight? What kind of give us a quick rundown of what to expect tonight?
Sure. So to put it simply, I want to sort of demystify color grading, or even introduce Capture One to the audience that might not be familiar with it. It is a great piece of software. A lot of people sort of think of it as sort of a one-ended thing, a sort of a one-trick pony. It's like, oh, it can only do this or only do that. And really, there's a really immense workflow that can be done, especially when it comes to color grading. And that to me is what I call the fun artsy side of photography, if you will.
Okay, but you have a few steps to get to before you get to the color grading side of things. So you got a bit of a presentation and then some photos we're going to edit, if I recall, right? So
absolutely, yeah. So I'll do a little presentation, a little walkthrough. Essentially, sort of from the bare essentials, the basics of basic editing, if you will, to something a little more in depth in terms of the actual workflow for the post processing, and then a couple of sort of pro tips in between. And then I'll do a little live demo so people can see sort of what I'm talking about, put into action, if you will.
All right, that sounds good. So like I said before, guys, if you have questions, we'll try and answer them during the presentation. We like to keep it pretty casual here, but we also will have a Q&A at the very end of the presentation as well. So without further ado, let's get going here.
Awesome. All right, let's share the screen. See that? Everyone good?
We're good.
Awesome. All right. Beautiful. Well, obviously, hello and welcome everyone to Mastering Portraits with Capture One, from base edits to stunning finishes. And thank you to obviously Dave, the entire team, the whole crew at the Camera Store. Shout out to them. Much love. As well as also to everyone at Capture One for hosting me and for this webinar today. I truly appreciate it. For those that don't know about me, my name is Giancarlo Pawelec, or as most know me on social media, if you will, it's Pawelec Photo or at Pawelec Photo. And I'm a commercial and editorial photographer based here in Toronto, Canada. So a quick little overview so you get an idea as to what I'm going to be talking about. I'll do a quick little intro as to myself, my background, if you will, why I chose or why I love Capture One ultimately, why you should too. New features, what I'm really, really excited to talk about, especially when it comes to workflow and efficiency. Folders and files, culling and selects, base edits and detail edits. So that's sort of the post-production side of it. And then obviously color grading. And there's some three sort of awesome points in there to address, which I hope you'll appreciate. Lastly, I'll do a little exporting aspect of it so you get an idea as to how I export my files and sort of how to simplify things for yourself. And then obviously a Q&A session and the live demo to sort of close it out. But as Dave mentioned, if you have a question, by all means, this is interactive. It's not really formally structured, if you will. Feel free to pipe in and I'll do my best to answer it, or the team can, of course. So let's begin, shall we? All right, awesome. Well, whether it be a simple portrait session or a commercial job, I firmly believe that unbounded creativity is often the result of working closely with clients and collaboratively with the team itself. And yes, this does apply to obviously post-processing. I'll explain later. I'll start with my favorite quote from Katharine Hepburn, and it says, "If you have to support yourself, you had bloody well better find some way that is going to be interesting." And photography is absolutely interesting. It's a great way to make money, to create a career, to meet people. And I'm a big fan of this quote because of that. I'm absolutely grateful. So I began my self-taught career about 2 decades ago, believe it or not, with automotive and motorsport editorials across North America before moving into portrait, fashion, and commercial work. By pushing my passion to the limit, I was given my first assignment from a magazine, and shortly after that milestone, I was able to actually shoot on contract for many other leading publications across North America, Europe, and some in Asia as well. Since then, my focus shifted from editorial and print work to commercial and for brands like Kenneth Cole, Jaguar, and Porsche. And ultimately, what started off as a hobby, hence 20 years ago or some 20 years ago, quickly turned into a passion and has granted me a career path which I love and cherish every day. Now, throughout the years, I've been able to hone my creative vision. I describe my signature style, for those that don't know, as a blending of an edgy feel with vibrant colors. And of course, post-processing wise, I tend to gravitate to more of a classical look, if you will. The more natural looking, the better, from my opinion at least. And with each project I take on, I always try and push forward. Now, be it with my lighting, my creative vision, and ultimately my workflow. The images and workflow that I produce nowadays far outweighs those of the past, but only because of the risk that I take and took back then. Ultimately, growing as a photographic artist, you always have to keep learning. Now, in the past few years, I've recently fallen back in love with black and white, shot both with natural light and with strobes in my studio. To some, black and white photography is the most raw form, other than shooting on film, of course, as it removes any influence by way of color. Now, with each and every shoot that I do, I try to incorporate a black and white session in it. And yes, even with commercial work, so that I can continue to evolve my craft. Now, enough about me. Let's get into it, shall we? Capture One, right? Why Capture One? Well, there's many reasons, but these are sort of, at least to me, the key ones, and why I use this awesome piece of software. The first and foremost, obviously, is folder organization. Now, having organized folders broken down into sets or looks, if you will, helps to keep the editing process flowing. Now, you could be taking 10 photos or you could be taking 1,000 photos. So if you're not organized, you're going to run into some issues. Next, obviously, is culling or rating of the images. Now, culling is tedious, but it is the most crucial part of the post-processing step, now outside of the edit itself. Now, after a shoot, there could be hundreds or, as I mentioned, thousands of images, and surely not every image will make the final cut. Now, I tend to use a simple rating system of 1 to 4. I'll get to that later. 1 being for behind the scenes, 2 for certain shots that are good, that made the first round of culling, 3 for shots that are great, and they will go into the final stage of culling, and 4 for shots that I consider as the hero shots or the portfolio-worthy shots that you immediately want to start editing. Flagging is another feature that I love. It's a great way to visually reference images, in this case, selects. Now, I use yellow for selects that I like. Green are for final edits of the files. Blue, I usually use for alternate edits. And pink, I use for client selects. I'll demonstrate that more in the live demo so you get an idea as to how I use things. Color grading, of course. Now, Capture One is incredible for color grading. This is the second last step, if you will, in the process. And it's usually done when the images come back into Capture One from Photoshop. And then lastly would be final adjustments, which is the final step of adjustments in Capture One. And these can include things like cropping or straightening, or again, more color grading adjustments as needed. All right, now I'm excited about this. These are new features in Capture One, and these are truly game-changing, at least from my opinion. They make the editing process far more smoother, and it's simple from the concept to the output on what it can do. So the first is layers and masks. Now, for layers and masks, the process is incredibly easy and it's very intuitive. There's options, all of which speed up the workflow process. In particular, masking. We all know that if you've ever masked anything, it takes some time. I'll just leave it at that. The first is obviously subject. So with a simple click, you can create a mask of the subject itself in the image. Now, there's no more time wasting of going over every line of the pencil tool and drawing things out. It can now literally be done quickly, efficiently, and accurately for the most part. The second option for layers and masks, the new tool, is background. Now, like with the subject option, the background, you can simply create a mask of it instantly. So it allows you to, let's say, change the background or alter how you see fit. You don't want a gray background, you want it to be purple. Simple. You click the background, it masks it. Now you're on to the next step. And lastly, people. This is my favorite masking option and my favorite tool, or feature rather, in the layer and masks option. Now, with no effort, I can now select everything from someone's face to simply the skin on their body and make adjustments to specific areas, such as tonality or even softening of the skin itself. Match look. This is another great option and quickly becoming a favorite of mine. I never thought I would until I used it at least. Now, as the name states, it allows you to match the look, if you will, of the file you're editing with a reference image or images, up to 15 of them with a single click. Now, this is absolutely wild. I'll demonstrate after, but I'm really stoked about this. The first obviously is match style or color grade, if you will. By simply dropping one or many reference images, you can match the color grade of any image you want. So I'll say that again. You simply drag and drop a file or 15 files as reference points, and you can color match or color grade rather the image that you're working on instantly. The second is match edits, and that's usually for base edits. So similar to the styles aspect of it, the edits are done on the reference images once they're applied. So these things are such as, or these things include rather, contrast or brightness, things to that effect. Next is the point that I mentioned earlier. You can use up to 15 reference images. Now, for anyone that is particular with their color, such as myself, having 15 images as reference points is incredible. You can also use things like Adobe's gradient color extraction. So essentially the bar that you see on the slide on the bottom right. And that itself is, for example, the reference image is from the Vogue cover, the latest Vogue cover with Lady Gaga on the cover. Somebody took that, dumped it in, and I got the little sort of color extraction gradient. So that gives you all the reference points of that color. And then last is the ideal aspect of color grading itself. Now, there's a couple sort of use cases which I think are phenomenal. One is, imagine shooting something for a client, let's say pre-pandemic, right? 4 or 5 years ago. And you don't have notes on how you color graded it or how you made certain adjustments. Now you can simply upload, if you will, or drag and drop 15 reference images, let's say from that shoot you did 4 or 5 years ago, and you can match that to what it was. And you no longer have to sort of eyeball the colors or guess what the color grade was. You simply use your 15 reference images from, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago, you drag and drop them, and voila, now you have a very close starting point from which to adjust things as needed or leave it as is. And the second one, of course, as a use case scenario, which I think is fabulous, is for those that shoot sort of high volume e-commerce or even wedding photographers themselves. Each tend to have their own unique color grade or style of how they like to edit and how the images look. Now, in this case, you can apply that same color grade to not just one image, but also a batch of images with a simple thing as one click, and that's it. So it really makes life a lot easier, makes your workflow a lot more efficient overall. Folders and files. Now, before we dive deeper into the post-processing workflow, it's essential to start with a proper system. Now, unless you plan on just doing one photo shoot, which I hope you don't, folders and files, this is something to take note of. Now, within Capture One, there's some great tools already offered, but one of them is sort of the folder structure. Now, the key to an efficient workflow is on the folder naming and the structure that you have. Now, for the folder naming, personally, this is what I use. So I use the following set. I use year, followed by month, by day, job name, and then secondary info. So like location, let's say, or if it's one particular person of that shoot. Now, thankfully, Capture One itself does a great job with the subfolders, and they're titled accordingly. Capture, which is where you capture your images, especially if you're tethering like myself. Selects is sort of where the culled images sit, or you transfer them to, rather. Output, self-explanatory. Those are the images that are now being exported. And then trash, accordingly, are images that are no good, and you obviously are going to delete. And lastly, obviously, is the file naming. Now, similar to the folder naming, I just sort of use the same folder name, but then I add my brand, so Pawelec Photo, at the end of it, followed by the set name and the image number in a chronological order. So it would be, for example, for today, it'd be 2024, it'd be 11, 14, underscore, Capture One, underscore, the camera store, and then in this case, it'd be underscore, Pawelec Photo, set one, and then image 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Again, if you have any questions about this, feel free to chime in. Culling and selects. Now, in simple terms, it's just picking sort of the best images for editing itself. It's probably, I'll be honest with you, the most boring part of the creative process, but ironically, it's also the most essential part of it. Now, pro tip, as I always like to say, get yourself your favorite drink, get yourself a good snack, and some great music to keep you in the zone. Culling and selects. Now, there's two steps as I sort of like to process my images. First is the culling. So this is obviously how I cull my photos. There is no steadfast rule. There's no right or wrong. To each their own, of course. But this is what has worked for me since I started my career. So the rating system that I mentioned earlier is very simple, how I set things up. One star rather, is sort of for BTS, or behind the scenes shots, or funny moments. So you have the makeup artist that goes on set, or let's say you're doing a test, right? You're testing for the lights, dialing everything in, and the subject decides to do goofy faces. Why not? It's cool. You never know. 2 is for keepers. Simply put, is the image good? There's no blinking. There's no weird faces. Everything sort of seems to be decent, if you will. You give it 2 stars, moves on to the next step. 3 stars are for images that are very good. Now, these are images that, as I joke around, they're the ones that sort of make your jaw drop. When you know, right? You're going through 100 images and you stop at a few of them. Those are easily 3s. Those are the ones that make you think and go, okay, that's advancing to the next stage, which is going to be the actual editing. And then 4 stars, very rare, of course, but it does happen, is what I call sort of portfolio-worthy shots, if you will. These are the hero shots. These are the ones that you're like, okay, these are, as kids call it, the bangers, right? These are the images that really, have that emotional connection or do something. There's something visceral about it and unique about it.
I got a question, actually. When it comes to culling all your images, are you keeping everything regardless of how you cull them, or are you willing to delete a bunch of stuff forever if obviously it's a bad shot, or do you keep everything from that session?
So I tend to keep everything. So I tend to use sessions, not catalogs. I tend to use sessions for my workflow. And yeah, I do tend to keep everything. The only thing I don't keep are the images that are in the trash. So for example, what's preventing an image being in the trash as opposed to, just not being in the selects folder, just in the capture folder, is an image that's okay. And it is what it is. But if it's the image, like you mentioned, someone blinking or there's a misfire in one of the strobes or whatever the case is, that's gone. That's in the trash. That's in the bin. Because to me, I joke around, but you never know. You might go back, a few years later in the archive and you dig up a session and you're like, oh, I want to re-edit this, or and sometimes you find the sort of hidden gems, if you will. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, for me, if it's obviously it's a dud, out of focus, blurry, like something I'm never ever going to look again, right? I have no trouble purging them. But when we're working on shoots where you have 100 images that are just slightly different and marginally different, do you keep everything?
Yeah, and I do. I tend to. I don't know if it's my OCD nature or what, but it's I like to keep all the files, and like I said, I might not look at them, but it was part of sort of the experience, if you will, right? I mean, I even mentioned the rating of 1 star for BTS or funny moments. I tend to joke around, but every time there's a makeup artist on set and they go and do a touch up, I tend to just hit a frame because I just sort of it's funny and you get sort of a natural reaction, and sometimes there's some cool unique moments. Those candidates that are all about the experience ultimately.
Great. Okay, carry on.
Yeah, no worries. So the second step in the sort of culling and selects process is obviously based off your culling, only the best ofs, and I can't stress that enough, only the best ofs. So anything with a star, essentially, yes, including the BTS funny moments, those can then be put into a separate folder later on. So all that then gets pulled into the selects folder. And these are simply just sort of drag and drop them, and it's there. It sits in your library tab in the selects folder, and I'll show in the demo. But only the ones with the stars. The ones that don't have the stars, I at least keep them in the capture folder. And as mentioned earlier by Dave and myself in the conversation, yeah, if it's sort of a dud image, blurry, out of focus, eyes are all wonky or whatever the case is, yeah, those go in the bin immediately. So only the best ofs then go into the selects folder. All right, base edits. Now we're getting to the fun part. So the tedious task of obviously culling the images are done, and you've now made your actual selects, so your captures and your selects, or in the case of commercial work, sometimes the client makes the selects. The next step is to do base edits in Capture One. So you fire up Capture One, and for these base edits, the focus is more on the overall aesthetic of the image from a technical point of view, not a creative one. So let me say that again. It's essentially you're focusing on the overall aesthetics of the image from a technical point of view, not a creative point of view. So what do I mean by that? Well, things like lens correction, a great tool to have, especially if you tend to use aggressive wide angles, let's say 15 to 35, things with a lot of distortion, or vintage lenses, for example. They tend to correct everything from chromatic aberration to light fall off. Next is obviously white balance. Most people are familiar with that, but if you're not, you can adjust or even correct the white balance or the color balance, if you will, of an image. And yes, even sometimes you need to do that in the studio environment. Now, this can seem like an oversight for most people, but in order to get the most out of your image, you need a great foundation to start from, and whereby all the colors are true as intended, right? You don't want to start editing an image that, let's say, has too much magenta, too much cyan, or is too underexposed, because then you're sort of trying to climb a ladder that just keeps on growing. So you're better off to start something fresh, something from ground zero, if you will, and then go from there. And I always mention to people that even a few 100 Kelvin in the color temperature itself of the image can have a dramatic effect on the mood of the image. If it's too warm, it could be comforting. If it's too cold, i.e. blue, then it might be seem as, not as comforting, a little more stoic, if you will. Next would be exposure, very self-explanatory, but does the exposure of the image itself need some tweaking? Maybe need to raise it a little, maybe to add some contrast for a little extra punch. Now, does the image need some brightness and lifting of the midtones? Do the colors themselves need some more pop? Or do you need to mute them with the saturation tool? All that's under the exposure panel. And all those little factors really, create the overall image that you want to start from ultimately, especially if you're shooting raw, right? You're starting from a true neutral baseline. And next would be the high dynamic range clarity tool. Now, I put an asterisk next to this because there's a few things to note. Now, the HDR tool is one of my favorites because it allows you to sort of save files. And actually, in the demo, I have a prime example of it, but where the highlights might be blown out. If you're shooting fashion, for example, like myself, usually jewelry and shiny wardrobe tend to have highlights that they tend to always be blown out naturally, but you can sort of recover that stuff. In turn, you can also lift shadows as needed. Now, the clarity tool as well is great. However, I have to remind people to use it sparingly. For me, it truly depends on the subject matter that I'm shooting and the mood that I'm trying to go for with the edit. Now, if I need to be a little more crunchy or have a little more pop, I tend to sort of play with the sliders, and you'll see how I work until I feel sort of enhances the image. If it doesn't enhance the image or enhances it too much, then I dial it down. And as a rule of thumb, I tend to sort of keep the guide number on the slider between sort of 8 to 12 max. I tend to not push it more than that. And lastly would be the black and white conversion, color grading. And again, this has an asterisk because again, although I usually prefer to do my black and white conversion and my color grading at the very end of my edits, there are some times that I do get a glimpse, or I do want to get a glimpse of what the final outcome would be. Now, remember that most actions themselves, especially in Capture One, can be undone. Simply like with black and white, you can toggle the black and white conversion on and off, so you can see what it looks like before and after. And it's a good way to sort of experiment before you start diving deeper into the actual editing itself, right? You might see an image and you might like it, but let's say it doesn't have that, doesn't give you that reaction that you're expecting. And then you might say, hey, let's see what it looks like in black and white. Easy, non-destructive. You click it and you see what it looks like in black and white, and who knows, man, you have an image that was okay in color and not in black and white with some contrast and clarity. Voila, now you have a gem. All right, layers and masks. So I'll get deeper into this. So for layers and masks, now I don't want to get into the details, but I usually tend to keep this sort of stuff very simple. Now, there's two big things that I tend to use. One is the background mask, as I mentioned. So depending on what the image calls for, sometimes the background needs a little tweaking of color. Even if I'm using something like a fashion gray or storm gray seamless background, I might say, listen, I was intending to shoot this with a gray background, but I want it to be purple, or I want it to be blue. So I can mess around with that. The second one, obviously, as I mentioned before, which I love, is the people option, or the people mask, if you will. And although there's many options in the drop-down menu, the two main that I tend to go for are what's referred to as face skin and body skin mask options. Now, despite what most people think, and there's a prime example there, even models themselves don't have even skin tonality, meaning that the color tone on the face, for example, might differ than on the chest, even on the hands. Right? But now with one simple click, the mask can be created. I can make the adjustment, go into the color editor, skin tool, and soften things out. I can do things very quickly in this case. That to me is key, especially when you're culling or editing. In this case, 30 images for argument's sake, right? So time is money. So in this case, you got to keep things going. And thankfully, Capture One of these tools, especially with this the people mask, it is so good at detecting things. But I'll show you that later. Detail edits. Now that the base edits, if you will, are done, you have a platform for which to start your editing. Now we can go a little more in depth. Now it's time in this case to get the Wacom tablet out, or whatever tablet you choose, and open up Photoshop. So again, just to sort of reiterate, I tend to use Capture One for my base edits. For detail edits, I go into Photoshop, and then I'll be back into Capture One. So for these detail editings, I still use Photoshop for these editing things such as removing blemishes, doing some dodging of the highlights, doing some burning of the lowlights or shadows, if you will, as well as also using the liquify tool as needed, of course. Now, I can also use it for composite imaging. If required, I can compose an image with others. I can change backgrounds or even the sky if needed. Again, it all is sort of as a need for the end result. And lastly are the actions and recipes part of it. Now, there's a few actions that I tend to use and prefer in Photoshop, which help my editing process faster. Now, instead of making multiple layers, for example, I just click a button, i.e. an action, and all the necessary adjustment layers are available to me. Again, at the end of the day, there's no right or wrong, but this is sort of what works for me. And to me, efficiency is key. I don't want to spend 3 hours editing the same image. If I can spend 10 minutes and get the image to 98% of what I want, then I'm happy, right? I can spend more time on other images or other creative outlets. All right, and more on the detail editing in Photoshop. As previously mentioned, I tend to use actions to make my workflow easier. And this allows me a quick setup to edit things like the TIFF file that I export from Capture One into Photoshop. Now, depending on the type of image and the concept that I want, my selections will vary, of course, but there's 3 main actions that I always tend to do all the time as part of my workflow. And the 3 are skin correction, makeup correction, dodge and burn. Now, with skin correction, self-explanatory. It's the most important one, as I mentioned before. It's removing blemishes, scars, unwanted marks, lint on clothing, things to that effect, as well as also evening out skin tonality, especially ideally under the eyes or the forehead, or what I guess what people refer to as the T-zone, right? So the tonality here will always differ than the tonality here, as well here, and so on and so forth, right? So you kind of want to keep things sort of even. Next would be makeup correction. Now, although makeup artists, treat them well, please. But although makeup artists do excellent jobs at what they do in the application, sometimes you need to even out the eyeshadow from one eye to the other. Sometimes you need to make a hard edge lip, and other parts that might need to be tweaked, of course, right? So these are things that can be done with the actions in Photoshop. And lastly, of course, my favorite one is the dodge and burn, or dodging and burn, or D&B, as I like to call it, which is an incredible action. So with it, you can do everything from remove wrinkles on clothing, you can even out skin, you can enhance shapes, especially in terms of fabric, for example. There's so much that you can do with dodging and burning. And if there's one skill that everyone needs to master or get a grasp of, it's absolutely dodging and burning. The next 2, of course, which is the enhanced catch lights and whiten teeth, are ultimately subjective, of course, and like most things, should be used sparingly. Now, as it can make the subject look unnatural, and I would almost say almost AI-like, if you will. Now, with most things, less is more, and I can't say that enough, right? Less is always more. So there's a fine line between, for example, enhancing someone's teeth and then make them look like they have dentures. Just saying. So less is always more, right? You can always toggle back and forth and see. Color grading, this is the fun part. So now with the base and the fine details edited, we can now move on to the final and most subjective step in the post-processing workflow, which is color grading itself. Now, for those unfamiliar with it, this is where the artsy aspect, if you will, of the image making process happens. Now, the same image itself can give off 2 different feels or 2 different vibes simply by what choice that you want in terms of how you color grade it. As I mentioned earlier, you can go warmer, you can go colder. The sky's the limit, if you will. So there's 3 main ways of doing color grading, and I tend to use all 3 depending on the mood, ultimately. There's a manual grading, there's styles and presets, and then as I mentioned earlier in the new feature, there's match look. Now with manual grading, it's the sort of the OG way, the original way of color grading an image. And it's simply by tweaking each and every level. So from the shadows, to the midtones, to the highlights, everything to suit your preference, of course. So you can be rustic and warm, or you can be modern and cool, you know? Now this way is obviously the hardest way to do it, especially when you're starting out. It's also the longest process, but once you get it and you get into the groove, you get it, and that's it. Next is styles and presets. Now, although many tend to sort of look down on styles and presets, some people call it cheating, if you will, there's some many great benefits of it. Now, to start, it gives you a quick reference point of where you'd like to take the image. Now, be it color or let's say monochromatic, black and white. Now, as well, some of it also being a way of inspiring you on how the image is going to look, right? You might not have thought about it, but you hit a style or a preset, for example, and it starts off a process. You start thinking, oh, maybe I thought the image was going to go this way. Turns out it's going to look better this way. And now you have a whole body of work that looks a certain way, if you will. You were inspired. Now, obviously, depending as well on the scope of the photo shoot or even the mood that I myself am in, I might use styles myself, albeit obviously I sort of dial it down and tone it down to what I like. But it's a good sort of starting point, if you will. And lastly, of course, my new favorite tool, which is the match look tool. Now, this feature, as I mentioned earlier, has simplified the workflow altogether. Now, I can use a reference image from a shoot I did, let's say, a year ago, and I can color grade the current shoot, and not only will it look similar, but it'll probably create the same identity in the body of work that I present. It truly is a unique tool to have in my tool chest. And again, just to stipulate that, you sort of drag and drop, and now you have that look. You have that style, if you will. And you can apply it to all your bodies of work. You can pull up old archival images and throw them in, and next thing you know, you've updated to your new style, right? Next one is the exporting aspect of it. So this is the final piece of the post-processing workflow process, which is exporting the files. All right, so this is very crucial, especially as you sort of finish, all the color grading, you finish all the editing. This is very crucial. So this is the pro tips, if you will. This is the key to note, obviously, is the final image check in Capture One. So this is the last time you'll actually have a look at your images before you release them out to the world. Sit back, take a moment, enjoy it. And always remember that things have gone obviously from your vision to reality, right? It went from I'm doing a shoot to now you have the product of that shoot and the look and the feel that you're going for. Next is the file export recipe. So there's various recipes to export, which include everything from sizing to resolution. But once you have yours dialed in, just save it, and I'll guide you that. I'll speak on that later on. Next is the file export location. Now, it's always best to save your export in the output folder within your section folder of the shoot. Now, naturally, Capture One will do that once you export, but it's always crucial to do it that way. Capture One built it for a reason. Super easy, especially for archivals. Next would be the file naming. Now, I always keep the session name as is, as I mentioned, so the year and the date, the details, with the addition of my brand, Pawelec Photo, and the resolution DPI. So it'd be 72 DPI or 300 DPI for print. All right. So exporting. So these are sort of my little pro tips, if you will, on how I export the images once I've done the edits and the color grading. So there's three sort of tabs that I sort of created, or selections rather. The first is the web, the second is the print, and the third is for socials. So I think I just call it socials, but yes, for social media. The web, I always export the web in JPEG format, 2048 pixels wide, or on the long side, if you will, at 72 DPI, that's 72 dots per inch. For print, I tend to also export as JPEG at 3300 pixels wide at 300 DPI. Obviously, if you need higher resolution or bigger files, you can also export it as a TIFF, for example. Just be aware that your files are going to be pretty beefy. And lastly is the socials. And that I export as PNG, again at 2048 pixels wide, and that is at 72 DPI. So I don't know if anyone has questions about that, but that's sort of my go-to workflow for exporting the files once the color grade is done. All right. So I will sort of conclude, if you will, this part of the presentation, which I simply state as, whatever you photograph, obviously find your passion and follow it. I'll also end with my favorite quote, of course, which simply states, in photography, there is a reality so subtle that it becomes more real than reality. That's from Alfred Stieglitz. It's a great quote. Fun fact: was also married to George O'Keefe.
That's some really good tips there for sure, and like a really good follow through of what Capture One can kind of do. And I'm looking forward to watching you in action. Edit a couple photos for us here. But do you have?
Absolutely.
I guess what are your sort of um, is Capture One for you more about speed? Is it a much faster editing program than some other ones on the market, or is it something
Yes,
that you've
I
just
tend to
become
find.
faster and faster
Yeah, I
doing?
mean, yeah. So I tend to find well two things more than anything. Well, actually three. Let's go with three things. Which is why I've been using Capture One for better part of a decade, I'd say, at this point now. Um, and those three of them. So one, I found it to be a very stable piece of software. And what I mean by that is, I tend to sort of being in studio most of the time. I tend to do a lot of. I don't know if I should just close this or not. Shut up. Oh, is that better?
That's all right.
Okay. Um, yeah, so I tend to do a lot of tethering, obviously, when I'm in the studio, and I find it to be sort of the most stable piece of software for it. I can simply unplug and plug back in, or unplug my camera, or turn it on and turn it off by accident, and it'll just sort of pick up where it goes. And to me, I joke around, but time is money. You also don't want to, at least for me, creatively, I don't want to break up the flow of a shoot. Even if you have a client, for example, let's say you're shooting corporate headshots, you don't want to sort of fumble around and be like, oh, my software doesn't detect the camera. So I've had no issues with Capture One since the very beginning. So I love that aspect of it, the stability of it. In terms of the efficiency of the workflow, it is bar none the best. I mean, even the simple thing of the raw conversion, and I was joking around with people, but if you want to get a real idea of Capture One and how superior it is, even on the base level of the raw converter from raw to JPEG, I always tell people download the trial and use what other software you want. For example, throw in a raw file and just export as a JPEG. Same specs, let's say 2048, 72 DPI JPEG, and put them both up side by side and tell me you don't see a difference. And that to me was very critical in my decision for choosing Capture One about 10 years ago or so, because I focused so much on lighting and sharpness and all these sort of things that if the software doesn't sort of back that up, and if anything, it degrades the file, then it's not doing me justice, if you will, or my work rather.
No, fair enough.
So that's the second factor. And lastly, and I always give the shout out even on social media to Capture One team. Every time they come out with an update, it's awesome. I mean, I joke around and say that they're sort of gremlins, not maybe gremlins, sort of wizards or whatever, because every single time there's an update or there's an innovation, a new feature, it's not just, we're making the user interface prettier or whatever the case is. It's actual things that, for example, AI being a big thing nowadays, instead of sort of using AI to replace a photographer, they're sort of using AI to make workflow more efficient, right? Like the masking, right? I now don't have to go in and draw it around and then create the eraser tool and make sure that's perfectly sharp and feathered. I push a button. Sure, I might need to tweak things here, but it's come down to just I push a button and the mask is done. And that in itself could save me 10 minutes. So the fact that every time they come out with a release or an update, and it really is a step in the right direction, like that's solidified my decision for Capture One.
Interesting.
I don't know if that answers your questions or not,
Yeah,
but yeah.
no, and I've also heard that, and we haven't mentioned it yet, that the Capture One is better at tethering than other programs as well.
It is superior. Like I said, I mean, you can disconnect, plug it in, turn the camera off, turn the camera on, and there's a lot of sort of creative benefits and technical benefits. But I tend to, if any of the audience have seen some other talks that I've done, I even talk about how even, for example, when I'm tethering Capture One, I might say, oh, I want to shoot this in black and white. I see the shot being in black and white, and I'll just hit black and white, convert it, and I might even do a little light color grading initially just to see what it is. And if I like it, I'm like, okay, we're good to go. And I start hammering away and I start shooting. And because it's raw, I can obviously undo a lot of these things. But it's great because it gives you a great starting point. So it it's the ease of use, right? You know, at the end of the day, I joke around, but it's like, you know, my accountants, they do the accounting stuff, the stuff that I don't like to do. So I want to do the stuff that I want to do, which is be creative and create images and take images. So if I have a piece, for example, of software that aids me and helps me do that better, I'm all for it, right? No piece of gear or software or anything should hinder your workflow. If it does, then I don't know. I think you're doing yourself an injustice.
Okay, well, sounds good. Well, let's before we get too far gone here, let's start editing a photo. Let's see what Capture One can do real time.
And I'm getting very philosophical now, right?
That was my next question: is what's your drink of choice when you're editing?
It depends. Is this a PG chat? I don't know. For today, it's just water, carbonated water. But I tend to, you know, depends on the edit. But sometimes I might, you know, might indulge in a little bourbon or something. You know, we'll see.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
All right, so let me see if I can share this sucker.
And while you're getting set up there, I mean, you have a beautiful home or a loft, whatever you have there. It's really well curated. Do you find that you're editing at the same time of day, or trying to make it as consistent? The environment that you're editing on is as consistent as possible to keep the color of the screen as consistent as possible, or are you looking at more the graphics that you can see on there and judging your colors and stuff off of that?
Right. Good question. So I'll be fully transparent. This is a virtual background. But I love it because this is sort of my dream, right? I have a beautiful loft studio, hard loft studio, sort of similar to this, just not as chic in downtown. But yeah, my workstation here at home, I can't stress this enough. But I mean, if you can afford it and you have the means to it, definitely get a color, not only a calibrated monitor, one that you can calibrate, and however you choose. I mean, in this case, I use the data color Spider Elite or whatever jazz it's called, or Pro or whatever. But you know, especially if you're doing sort of color critical work, you need to have a monitor that can display true colors, right? We focus so much on color balance and white balance and all these sort of things, and then you know we don't think about the fact that, well, the output, what we're actually looking at, is going to make a big difference. So yeah, in terms of even my editing, I tend to, you know, my wife jokes around, but it's like I tend to be sort of a hermit because I like the least amount of light as possible. I don't know if it's just myself or all photographers, but we like being in dungeons, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's just my cozy space, right? So as I mentioned, you know, get a good snack, get a good drink, put some tunes on, and just sort of get in the zone, right? Because you have to, I hate to say it, but you have to sort of be in the right mindset as well to edit, right? If you're not in the mood and you're feeling a little funky, you know, unless you have a deadline, let's say, push it off to the next day.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, be in the right headspace because it's
for sure. Yeah, it's the least sexy part about photography. You know, sitting at your computer, you're photographing some amazing stuff, and then you have to sit in a dark room and spend hours, you know, going through the whole process and wondering what your decision was and what you should have done at the shoot instead.
Absolutely, and we're all guilty of it, right? Or the other thing that I tend to be guilty of, and I'm trying to learn, is sort of being overly critical. I mean, sometimes I'll edit things, and I don't know if you can see my screen here with Capture One.
Yeah.
Okay, but sometimes I'll tend to sort of edit things to the point that I'm legit like 200% focused in. You know, I'll be all the way in here, only then to realize like this isn't going to be a billboard. Like why am I so zoned in? But you know, it happens to us, right? So I always tell people, like, be in the right headspace, put the right music on. It's part of the artistic process, right? So if you're not in the right headspace, then I don't know how good the output would be, unfortunately. That's just me being real.
No, fair enough. So this is a sample image. This is like, what do we got going on here?
Yeah. So I have a few sample images. I have 3 of them. And as I mentioned earlier, so just to give you an idea, so just for this session, I don't know if you can see it here, but it says 2024, 11/14. So that's today's date. underscore the camera store, the host obviously underscore capture one underscore webinar. And I can't stress that enough because I always tell people, like, it's funny if you're editing 2 images, 3 images, or 1 shoot. When you start editing 10 shoots, 50 shoots, 100 shoots, 1,000 shoots, your folder structure is gonna mess you up if you don't have things squared away. So maybe blame my OCD of being very structured, but the key is the less you can remember and just more body mechanics and in that sense, then the easier it is. These 3 images that I have here, one is of a model named Sophia, and this is 2 images from a recent shoot with a Latin Grammy recording artist named Fito Blanco. These are untouched in any scenario. I don't know if you can see here my quick menu, but nothing has been selected at all in any of these images. And I just, while we were sort of waiting, I decided to sort of mess around a little and just get an idea as to sort of the potential of what can be done with color grading and how it, I mentioned earlier about the mood, but there's prime example, 2 different color grades and how they give off 2 different moods, right? But I'll start off with this one. Now in this file, it's great. This is sort of a fun shoot that I was doing with this model. In this case, for whatever reason, I've obviously blown out her skin, right? This is the exposure highlight. Very, very crucial here. I can't stress this enough to anybody, whether you're shooting for socials, let's say, or for web or in print. If you don't have this on, you're doing your files a disservice. This is crucial. This is essentially telling me, hey, buddy, there's no data here. There's no information here. You've essentially cooked her. Now, we might say, oh, but I can see things here. And if anyone's aware of color, for example, if you look at the top, right, you have 253, 227, 201. So that's your RGB, right? I'm almost to the point that I've now cooked her whereby there's no data there, meaning if I was to, for example, print this file, even on a non-photo printer, there literally might not be any ink whatsoever on her face. That's sort of the real world scenario of it. So this would be a big no-no, to say the least. But again, if I use the high dynamic range tool, I can pull things back and I'm not worried. Alternatively, obviously, I can lower my exposure, which in this case, I'm like a 0.7 of a stop, if you will, from where I should be. So I'm not too worried. If I was overblown, I'd be concerned. But in this case, I feel safe enough that I'm like, okay, I can recover. There's enough data there in these files. Especially nowadays, to be fair, I shoot Canon R3 and R5, and there's so much dynamic range in these files that there's a lot of leeway. But just as a rule of thumb, always have your exposure warning up on the screen. Make sure to toggle it on and off, and to obviously, when you're shooting, to make sure that you're not blowing out any skin. But let's begin to give everyone an idea. Let me just, in 1 second, I'm going to connect my tablet, my tableau. It's me trying to be fancy in French. All right. So as many may notice, it might look weird, but I'm a lefty, so don't judge. If I had top-down camera, you see that my tablet is sort of like awkward, if you will. It's the other way. Most people have the other way, but that's all right. Whatever works for you. Some people even use the loop. Yeah, some people use the loop deck, I think it's called.
Yeah.
With toggles and such. So to each their own. It's whatever works for you, of course. So to start, very basic. Like I said, I always start with my basic edits. So in this case, obviously, we have the histogram. We're looking, everything's good there, but let's do a little lens correction. So this was shot with the RF 7200, a great lens, and obviously there's a profile for it. Another sort of kudos, if you will, to Capture One. I find it that it's the only software, and I mean, you can quote me saying this. It's the only software that when cameras release new firmware or new cameras are released, I kid you not, I think that's like the same day or the next day, Capture One has an update for said camera or said profile of the camera. I don't know how they do it. I still think they're wizards and it's magic, but that's a great thing, because I find a lot of people tend to buy cameras, for example, or new lenses, and there's no lens profile or camera profile for it with other software. Whereas Capture One, magically, they're always on the ball. So shout out to them for that. So in this case, with the RF 7200, there's not much chromatic aberration. It's a fairly good lens, as you can see. You can click the diffraction, obviously correction, not much there. And then I have three sliders here, which is the distortion, the sharpness, and the light fall off. Now, in this case, obviously, not an issue because we're shooting sort of in a light gray background. And the distortion, as you can see, not much there, right? Can I bump it up to 50? Sure. Is it going to make much of a difference? Not really, right? I mean, we're looking at sort of sharp lens. These are what I tend to recommend when you start using older glass, older lenses, especially those that like to use vintage glass. There's usually a lot of distortion and barrel distortion and aberration, stuff like that. And this tool is awesome for that, to correct those things. So base characteristics, I kept this neutral, so it's on auto, if you will. I shoot raw, of course. You can see here, it's a CR3 file. And then white balance. So here we go. Obviously, you have different options. You have auto, you have daylight. I tend to do, even though most people like to do 5200 for daylight, I tend to somehow go to 5500. Don't ask me why. It's just what my eye likes. But again, to each their own. So I'm going to adjust it to 5500 as a custom. The tint, we can keep it as is. That's not that much of a concern. Now, for the exposure, overall, I like where the exposure is. We can obviously bring part of it down. But I'm not too concerned. If I do, let's just bring it down just right here. Get a -33. Contrast, I'm going to kick this up just a little. Now, I always recommend, especially when you're dealing with faces or portraits, not to say that the whole image doesn't matter, but really, as always, people are looking at the face, right? So you want to make sure that if let's say, for example, you're using the contrast slider, that you don't go too heavy, right? Because then it looks like a 90s grunge video. So I tend to keep it sort of low. I tend to go between 5 to 7. Again, once I'm done the edits, I can go back and add more if needed. And I always tell people sort of less is more, because you can build on it. You can add multiple layers in Capture One. You can add multiple layers in Photoshop. But undoing things sometimes might pose a challenge, right? Brightness, I'm okay. Highlights, let's recover some of those highlights and pull that down. I don't know if you can see up here on the histogram, but immediately we're sort of recovering that and we're looking sort of good. Let's go to -50 just for argument's sake. So here we're fairly good. We have a little more here on the nose, but I'm not too worried about it. I mean, I'm obviously zooming in this close, so not much of a concern. Shadows, is there anything we want to lift? Maybe just a hair. I mean, where are we at here? We're at 10, so +10. So not too bad, right? It's lifting some of the shadows in the dark areas. We're talking like black leather jacket, denim, black denim, dark brunette hair. So sometimes you want to lift a little bit of shadows and the clarity. This is the slider I was telling you about to be careful with, of course. I'll just zoom into her face a little bit more. Obviously, you don't want to go too aggressive, because then again, so it's looking like a comic book or like a 90s grunge video. And the same thing with structure. You don't want to go too aggressive with it either. So in this case, I tend to, like I said, keep things between sort of 8 to 12. Just for today, let's just go 10 and 10 for argument's sake. 10 and 10, okay? So from this point, I'm like, okay, I sort of like where this is going, right? This is a much better thing. Obviously, you can do the before and after, which is right here. You can also keep in mind, if this looks very weird to people, the reason it does look weird is because I have a particular workspace. So I like to have my tools and tabs on this side and my images at the bottom. Some people like the default Capture One, which has the images on the right and the tools on the left. But you can map things however you want. I mean, that's the one thing I also love about it. I can say, hey, I want the lens correction tool, and I just drag it out, and now I'm sort of focused on just this, or I can just put it back again. So in this case, I like where this is going. This is sort of my base edit, and I'm like, yeah, it's not bad. This is decent for now. If I wanted to get an idea as to, for example, how it looks in black and white, again, I can go to the Styles tab. That's where I have it here. And also it's worth noting, there's a bunch of tabs that you can add and adjust accordingly. Everything is sort of magnetic and you can move things around, or you can pull things out, of course. I have essentially a library tab for the main workflow. My quick menu is what I have for my base edits. That's how I would sort of describe it, as the quick menu. Sometimes obviously I have here for like match look as well. Style tends to be sort of my black and white workflow, and then I have adjust. Some people use the color tab, but I have this for my color editing and color balance, curves, things to that effect. So now that we've done the base edits here, I like where this is going. If you want to get an idea of where we started from, that's where we started from. This is where we're at already. It's not bad. It's almost giving sort of like a Calvin Klein denim fashion vibe, if that makes sense. So here we're good. Now that we also marked it yellow, I tend to sort of use yellow for images that I have selected that I want to edit. So in this case, for example, these are our other ones, so I haven't marked them. But if I was to select them, again, yellow is the edits, and green, naturally, yellow sort of caution, green being good to go. Those are sort of the final edited files. So from here, it's very simple. I go into edit with. Let's go into Adobe Photoshop 2025. It'll open up as a TIFF at 300 DPI. And any second. Can you see this screen as well or no?
Yeah, I can see it just fine.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to make sure. All right, so the first thing I tend to always do, as always, is I do Command J. I'm on a Mac, and I do Command J because essentially what you're doing is you're duplicating the file. The reason being is, let's say for argument's sake, I decide to mess around, and let's say I make a massive mistake, right? I'm like, oh, I messed up completely. Well, you can undo things, or you can just simply toggle on and off, or just delete it, right? So I always tell people, never work in the background layer, always start on a copy layer. I'll start with my little pro tip cheater hack if anyone's interested, especially in fashion photography. People always tend to like to look taller, but naturally people and people's faces tend to look better a little bit taller. So my little pro tip, sneaky here. This is for the camera store because I love you guys. I tend to sort of do the Command T, so transform. I hold Shift, and then I sort of stretch the canvas just a hair. Now, it sounds silly because it's only like yay much, but it really does make a difference overall. You can see, for example, just the simple sort of difference that makes. It sounds silly, but everything just looks a little bit better. This was taught to me by a longtime fashion photographer that I'm super grateful for teaching me that, because I think it's a cool little cheater thing. But for some reason, especially with people or portraits, everyone tends to just look better.
Yeah, it's all these little things. It's all about subtleties. It's not anything drastic. But all the subtleties add up to making a big difference.
Absolutely, very much so. And like I tell you, like less is more, right? But it's these little things that make the difference of a good image, which is great, and most people do that, and then a great image, which is one that you're proud of, that you share, and ultimately you might get work from, right? So now with that said and done, I'm going to go into the next step, and my next step, as always, is in this case, I tend to sort of remove any blemishes or anything I don't like in the file itself. Oops, turn my touch on. There we go. So for example, things that I don't like. Oh, why is my touch being weird? Touch on. There we go. All right, so things that I think are weird, for example, that would drive me nuts, that I just want to sort of clean up. And I was mentioning, like, there's little things here. So this is very easy. I just grabbed sort of the spot healing brush. You can also use these other tools. Each has sort of their perks and their benefits, but just things like this, little spots, whatever. If I want to be finicky, and everyone sort of has the running joke, especially graphic designers, of the final file, and it's like final file version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4. I'm guilty of that as well, but for this sort of webinar, I'm going to call this, what do I call this? Blemishes. I call it blemishes and bad stuff. Is that fair? Does that work, Dave?
That works for me.
All right, blemishes and bad stuff. So if you want to get rid of blemishes and bad stuff, right? So I'm getting rid of sort of the spot here, a little bit of the lint on her leg there. Anything up here, everything tends to look kind of decent. I don't mind. There's a couple strays here. Now, naturally, you can create a layer for just your hair specifically. In this case, I'll simplify it. I mean, this to me looks like bad stuff. So let me just zoom in. And again, no one's ever really going to look at an image this close. So it was a reminder for people that less is more, because otherwise you'll zoom in and no one's really going to be aware of it, right? But so in this case, it's just very simple. I'm just going in here. I'm not even hitting remove. I'm just sort of doing a quick little job. The rule of thumb also, just so people are aware of a bit of a pro tip, especially when you're editing hair, for example, a lot of people tend to over edit hair, for example, in that they remove absolutely every little crazy strand. The issue with that is it then starts looking like a wig. The rule of thumb tends to be that whatever hairs are crossing, those are the ones you want to remove. And the reason being is that your brain, or the viewer's brain rather, will sort of assume that it's one flowing piece of hair, if that makes sense. So this is not maybe the ideal example, but okay, so here's one, for example. So this is the hair, right? So no one's really going to care about this because it's sort of expected, right? Your brain's like, oh, it's her hair and she's rubbing it, so you're going to get that look. But for example, if you want this to look a little nicer, these little small crosshairs, right? It's what sort of cuts the eye. The eye is what sees these hard lines that are sort of intersecting, or in this case, some of the highlights, right? We're picking up some of these hair highlights in it, and it sounds silly, but just by doing sort of simple things like this, right? And again, I'll give an example like here, or this one that's crossing, right? And I'm not going overly clean or simple or particular on this, but I just want to exemplify. Okay, so let's call it this, right? So now, hopefully that's enough. Oh, that's really distracting. This one. Okay, so see, even I'm not satiated already. But just a simple thing like this, I don't know if you can see the detail on it, but just a simple thing on these crosshairs, if you will, make a big difference, right? It goes from looking kind of messy to almost a controlled messy, if that makes sense. So you don't have to go in and literally delete or clone out every little sort of piece of hair. You can sort of get away with certain things, right? Again, if this is a commercial fashion shoot or something to that effect, whereby there's going to be a lot of eyeballs, then I'll be a little more meticulous about it, right? But overall, this tends to sort of be the rule of thumb. So things like, this crosshair over the neck, things to that effect, right? Yeah. Even cleaning sort of this neck. I'd probably use the heel tool for that. That's okay. So let's continue with blemishes and bad stuff. Let's get rid of some of these sort of blemishes, if you will. Again, I'm going sort of quick, if you will, here. Some blemishes aren't so nice. That's the other issue too, is you kind of also have to be aware of the subject. Because sometimes, for example, they might have a beauty mark and it might look like a blemish, or to you it might be, but that's part of the person. So I think as a photographer, especially when you're doing retouching, you also have to understand the ethics of it. And I always tell people, if this is sort of how you present yourself, then that's all I'm going to edit you, right? Just like if you're doing, for example, headshots, and some people say, hey, I want to take photos, but not with my glasses, right? Because I look better without my glasses. But if most people know, you, Dave, as always having glasses, they maybe focus on photos of you having glasses, right? So there's a fine line that us as photographers have to, should adhere to, rather.
Yeah, we still you want people to look. Yeah, you want people to look very much like themselves, still represent themselves accurately, and then people aren't perfect. So I find a lot of photographers over edit skin, and they have this sort of plastic look.
Absolutely, and that's why I always say, people. I mean, it's less is more, right? You want to have texture, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if it's a beauty shoot and a beauty edit for Lancome, let's say cosmetics or something, that's a really tight beauty shot, I get it. The intention of that is to oversell the luxury lifestyle and that aspect of it and how good the cream is or whatever. But realistically speaking, I think especially in this day and age with between AI and the world that we live in, sometimes it's better to just be a little more natural, right? So in this case, overall, this looks decent to me. I'm not, I wouldn't sort of fuss with this anymore. But to give you an idea, just a simple sort of thing before and after.
Yeah.
All right, so that's blemishes and bad stuff. Next is my favorite action, which I mentioned is the skin correction. Now, there's two options here. The actions I have 8-bit and 16-bit. I don't need to go into detail, but simply put, with 16 bits, it allows you to it gives you a lot more a range, if you will, for the color variants, if you will, and the tonality of color. So that's what I always actually before I do that. Let me just actually. So I always tell people as well, because I've been unfortunately caught having issues whereby I get a little trigger happy with my keyboard and I might hit Command Q. I always tend to sort of merge layers. So in this case, I did blemishes and bad stuff. And I always tend to sort of merge layers. So that way, at least I know that that hard work is done. And then obviously I save the file. I tend to do it because I have unfortunately sometimes closed the file, and to remove blemishes and hairs and all that is very tedious to say the least.
Time consuming and tedious. So we've all made those mistakes before. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's you kind of sort of want to have one more drink and then pack it in for the night. You know what I mean? Okay, so let's call this blemish and bad stuff, or bad. I can't type tonight. That's okay. Okay, bad it is. Okay, so now into the skin retouching. Very easy. I'll grab a nice soft brush. So in this case, my opacity is at 100. My flow is at 50, and I'll give everyone a little pro tip. When the biggest I find, like I said, in terms of tonality gradation, is sort of that T-zone in the face, but also underneath the eyes. So as you can tell here, there's difference in tonality here, right? Everyone ends up having sort of bags under the eyes. And if you remove the bags, some people tend to sort of clone or heal it, you end up looking a bit like an alien, if you will. So the way to make it look natural, because as humans, you're supposed to have bags under your eyes. It's a feature that we have, but you don't have to sort of enhance it. You can almost tone that part down. So what I do, a little bit of a cheater trick here. So I get a soft brush into the skin correction, and I'll pick out a couple. Oh, what just happened? There we go. Okay. All right, my Wacom went crazy. All right, so I tend to pick up a couple sort of points here, just underneath here, and then what I end up doing is I end up getting a soft brush. Let me just enlarge that, and I just sort of go in and I kind of just sort of massage it, right, just around, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to even the tonality so that way it doesn't jump. I'll pick up a couple other spots, and again, all I'm trying to do is not remove the bags under the eyes, but just almost sort of soften them a little, right? So it kind of blends in a little bit better. I'm sort of doing, I would assume, what fillers do, for some people in sort of the cosmetic world. Except this is way cheaper and painless. Now I'm going to get sued by some cosmetic company. Watch. All right, so to give you an idea, this took 15 seconds. Let's call it 30. But now you'll see sort of the before and the after.
Oh, very cool.
Right. So again, I'm going very, very deep in the edit. From back here, it does make a difference.
Now, do you find that?
Right.
Do you find obviously, Photoshop has a lot of keyboard commands. Do you find that you're using a lot of keyboard commands in Capture One as well, or is it more cursor based?
I'm a mix. I mean, it's for me, it's not like a hippie in saying this, but like it's all about a flow, right? If I'm in a flow, sometimes I tend to use a lot of shortcuts, or commands, of course, and then sometimes I tend to sort of just click. It really depends on the flow of the edit, if you will. But yeah, that's sort of my best answer, if you will, right?
Okay.
Okay, so we did the skin edit. That's a very simple thing. That looks good to me. Now let's go into the next one. So we can go into sort of the makeup correction. Makeup correction is similar to skin correction. In this case, there's not really much to there's not much to correct. I mean, I guess I could sort of darken this on this side. Let's do it just for these explanational reasons. Oh. Let's see. Pick up a couple colors. Oops. And I'm just going to transfer some of that. So just small little things. We'll go into dodge and burn. So that's what I mentioned. So I tend to sort of, like I tell people, sort of burn the shadows and dodge the highlights. Very easy in this case. So you want to burn some of the eyebrow. Now you don't want to go too dark. You don't want to make them look like Muppets. But things like sort of the crown of the head, whether it's a male or female subject, short hair, long hair, you sort of want to fill that in, darken it. The other beautiful thing I always tell people is if you were to use dodge and burn, for example, on hair or clothing, it almost gives it sort of that 3D pop effect. And I'll exemplify it here. I'm just going to burn, for example, certain parts of her hair. And again, I'm using very, very soft brush here. And then let's go into dodge. Make sure you hit X so we change to a white. And I'm just going over sort of some of the highlight parts. All right, so now you get an idea of the two. That's, oops, that's the burn. That's the dodge.
Very cool.
So it sounds weird, but it gives us sort of a 3D pop effect, right? And all I'm doing is messing with the file. I'm making the darkers go darker, making the lighters go lighter, right? If I want sort of to accent the nose, which tends to be a very popular thing with most subjects, you just add a little bit of highlighter right down the center of the nose, right? And then maybe a little bit on the lip as well. And it's a little detail, but it's a little sort of a chef's kiss, right? It's just a little details. Next would be the enhanced catch lights. So I'll zoom in for this. So there's two ways you can do the actual catch light itself, or you can go into a bit of the eye just to pull up some of that color, especially with us folks with dark eyes. It tends to look a little too dark. And as you can see, for example, in this case, you can see sort of the key light, and then there's a sort of reflector underneath, or sort of I guess it's a V flat underneath. But if you notice as well, it's almost a little too much in my opinion. Right? It looks, like I was mentioning, it looks a little unnatural. So, oops. There we go. So in this case, for example, I might even sort of lessen the opacity just a hair. Let's go down to, let's say, 33, my favorite number. There we go. And just enough. It's just a little bit of a kiss, right? And then teeth whitening, that's not really needed. So in this case, just to sort of go over what I did. So I expanded the canvas itself, made it a little bit bigger, right? So she looks a little taller, a little leaner. Remove the blemishes and the bad stuff, or the bad, as I called it. I did some skin correction. In this case, I did it mostly sort of under the bags of the eyes. Right? If I wanted to be a little more particular, I would sort of go around here, get rid of that, things to that effect. Then I did a little makeup correction. So I brought out more on the eyes, sort of matched this one a little more to that one. Again, into dodge and burn. And then lastly, of course, enhancing the catch lights. So for this now, we just grab all of these and let's merge them, merge layers, and then Command S for save. So once it's saved, I can close this guy and go into Capture One. Can you see me in Capture One? No, yeah, I mean, you can do a lot of that actually. In fact, in Capture One, I, I guess more the fact that like I just got so comfortable in my workflow to do, like I said, the fine detail editing, and because I have action set up in terms of creating layers, it's just easy for me to sort of set up the action for dodge and burn, and it's ready to go. But the same things could be done in Capture One. You can keep everything literally all in the one software, if you will, right? I mean, there's a bunch of options here. Let me just mark this green, so that way we know that that's sort of the before and then the after, right? Just to give you an idea of the sort of the quick edits we did, right? So just little enhancements, but obviously in oh, mark this blue so I know. So for example, so in this case, oops, let's remove from document. Sorry. Okay, there we go.
Point to
So
where you would start adding styles or experimenting with different like preset styles.
yeah,
You've already done a lot of
so
the
this would be
subtleties.
after I did the sort of I did the base editing Capture One, did the more fine tuning blemishes and stuff like that in Photoshop, and then I put it back into Capture One for any and all final tweaks. But just to sort of answer your question before, so here's for example the blemishes and everything else, and in turn I can also, oops, sorry, my touch sensitivity is very high. There we go. So I can also, for example, I have tools here, and I can do, for example, draw healing mask, cloning mask, remove dust, remove spot. So if I want to sort of remove things, whoa, hold on. There we go. Gotta love the touchpad. All right. So I can also, for example, remove things here accordingly, right? And it'll pull from around. So there's definitely different ways of doing it. You can also burn and dodge here as well, right? You have obviously the brush tool itself. So there's so many different ways you can do it. Again, there's no right or wrong. It's sort of, this is sort of what works for me. But ultimately, I hate to admit this, but I'm going to admit this. Ultimately, I'd like to get away from that brand of product, if you will. So we'll see. Okay, so onto this, for example. Now that we're back here, and we can move on to the color grade. So there's a few things we can do. We can do things like obviously enable black and white if I want to make it sort of black and white, which kind of works. There's also the other aspect, which is with styles and presets, right? So there's some great built-in styles that you can do as a base things, from obviously brighten contrast and everything else, which really you can see the effects in real time, which I absolutely love. Because if you don't like it, then you don't like it. To sort of creative edits in this case. So these are sort of styles or color grades, if you will, that are sort of baked in or built into Capture One. And they're great again as a starting point. Now you might, for example, have this image and say, cool, this is great. This is exactly what I was looking for. I don't need anything else. Or you might say, you know what, forget it. I want to do things myself. So if you want to do things yourself, go ahead.
Yeah, while you're talking there, Deeb's got a question for you. He's like, does Capture One offer a brush tool that can adjust exposure, dodging and burning directly within the software?
Yes, you can. So the brush tool is up here, right? And so with the brush tool, you can create all kinds of things. You can actually literally you brush something in, for example, and you can even sort of lower the exposure or lift the exposure. And I can even go further in. I'll show you in terms of even like the masking of even the skin, right? If you want to sort of up that, or you want to even the tonality of the skin, right? In this case, I would have to, for example, mask all this in, and then all of this, and then obviously remove the mask on the eyes. But with certain tools, obviously, it makes it a lot easier. But yes, you can essentially do the same thing. It's just from my workflow, it's not as fast, if you will, or rather, I guess I'm just not as used to it. But yeah, the same thing can be done.
As far as that editing goes, are you 80, 90% of it done through Capture One and 10% in Photoshop, or do you have kind of an idea?
It's a 50-50. I would say Capture One is a good 80% of my workflow. And it might sound silly to say that, but it's because everything from the image capture itself through tethering is done through Capture One. through the culling, the editing, that sort of aspect of it, the base edits. Like I said, I solely use Photoshop just for fine detail tuning in that sense, or liquefying tools, right? Things that, so in this case, if I want to sort of push this in, right? And then ultimately it goes back into Capture One. So I use Capture One for majority of the workflow, literally from image capture to output. And Photoshop is sort of my crutch, if you will, to sort of finesse things as needed. But color grading, all that major stuff is all done through Capture One. I know you can do color grading in Photoshop, and I guess it's called Camera Raw, I think it is. But I just, yeah, that's not for me. I prefer the color grading tools in Capture One. It's a lot more intuitive and a lot more specific, right? Like there's like, for example, there's a color editor here, and I can select certain colors or certain things, like let's say yellow, and I can start finessing things accordingly, right? I mean, that might be a bad color. You might not be able to see, right? But you can see her neck, for example, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully you can see. Okay. So there's a lot of things that I think Capture is far more powerful in doing. But yeah, either or. For the color grading for this, for example, I tend to always start, there's a few ways of doing it. You can use the color editor, and you can use the color balance. I always joke around, or at least I tell people that the simplest way to do it, for example, is let's go new filled layer. In this case, sort of use the master tool to get an idea as to sort of the look and the feel that you're going for, right? Obviously, this affects a lot of the image, but in this case, it gives you an idea as to sort of how images will look. Now, in turn, you might say, okay, well, I don't want to do that, but I do. Oh, there you go. But I want to make the shadows, let's say, a lot more bluer, right? So in this case, it's going to pull a lot of these clothes or her clothes into that space, right? So let's say, for argument's sake, I'm going to go extreme here. Let's go with the blue. And now, for example, the highlight, in turn, I always recommend, it's not a must, but you always want to go sort of the opposite side of the color wheel, of course, right? And adjust how it is. Now, in this case, she looks a little bit like an alien, so I can also tone that down. No disrespect to aliens, of course. And I can tone this down. Now, the beautiful thing about this is my opacity is set to 100, but I can always tone things down, right? So to give you an idea, just within, a 2-minute gap, we took an image that was kind of good from the get-go as a base edit to something that's a little more, what I would consider in this case, a little more editorial as a shoot, right? Again, another option I'll get into further here is the other aspect. So let's go into, for example, this image of Fito Blanco. Again, with a base edit, nothing is done. There's things I want to make sure, for example, that there's catch lights and everything else. Now, please, do me a favor, folks. If you're photographing people, please make sure there's catch lights. And for those wondering, catch lights are these tiny little lights inside the eyes, right? It's what creates, the life, if you will, in the eyes. If you don't have those, unfortunately, your subject tends to look a little dead in the eyes. So having catch lights in the eyes, super, super crucial. But in this case, obviously, it's a little bit under, in my opinion, from what it should be. So we can start simply with, let's go to 5500 if I want, for example. There's, right, just a simple sort of color temperature from what it was. So that's what it was shot. And then, oh, did I get rid of custom? Yeah, I got rid of custom. Right? And then from here, let's add a little contrast, just a punch. Let's lift the shadows a bit. A little too much, that's a bit better. Let's add some clarity. A little structure in here. I don't want too crunchy. And from the get-go, we're not bad. Now, there's things we can do. In this case, for example, I just did a simple black and white conversion, right? So, we're almost done. You might say, oh, okay, well, that works. But then you might say, okay, well, let's do something simple. Let's go into, for example, black and white and go with a punch, or let's say black and white soft, right? So in this case now, you might say, this is great. This is exactly what I wanted, right? This is the black and white that I wanted. And if you want, for example, to do things like, let's see if I can. Let's play zoom in more. Whoa. A little bit of lag. There's a lot of lag.
That's the thing about
What's
technology.
it doing?
It's never fast enough.
Yeah, I was like, hold on. What? Now it's not. What's it doing? There we go. Now I'm back. Okay, let's go back. There we go. There's a little bit of lag there. That's okay. Oh boy. Do it again. For example, I can go into here for the brush as an example, right? So and I can toggle the mask, and oh, come on. I can lift the shadows in that. I don't know if people can see, but there you go, right? So obviously I'm doing a simple sort of quick cheater way, but to give you an idea, just for sort of a quick sort of mask in this case, add a little more life to the eye, if that makes sense. And obviously naturally you do this to the opposite eye. So there's one way of doing it. This is another way of doing it. So this way, for example, uses a style, and I use obviously the mask for the eye. In this case, it's just a very straightforward conversion. Right? And all
Are
it
these
is,
all preset styles, or are you they're built in?
This one was a preset style called Black and White Soft. It's the built-in style in Capture One, so it gives you a great sort of starting point. But like I said, use this as a guide, right? You might say, "Oh, I like this, but I want to add more stuff to it." Well, you can go into curves, for example. Oh, where are we at? And then from here, for example, there's your green, there's your red. You can mess around accordingly and see. Oh, oops. That's why it's in the wrong mask. There you go. Wrong layer. So you can mess things accordingly. You can even sort of do a 5-point all channel thing, and then create sort of the infamous sort of S curve. So the sky's the limit, right? I just want to demystify it, because a lot of people are like, oh, styles are bad or presets are bad. They're bad, I think, if you rely on them.
Fair enough.
They're not bad if it's a starting point for your edit, or if you're in the middle of a shoot, right? Like in this one, for example, this was sort of a simple top light with like a 7-foot umbrella and a diffusion or a sock, if you will. But in this case, it's sort of very straightforward, because it gives you an idea as to sort of what the finished end result is. Now, ultimately, this was a color image. Which actually doesn't look bad. I like the color image as well, but this gives you now a different variable as to what you can do. And in this case, like I said, I just sort of tweaked and used a style, this black and white soft style. In this case, there is no black and white soft style. I just used the simple black and white converter, right? Or conversion. So there's 3 ways. So there's sort of the manual way, the styles way, if you will. Sounds like an ad, the styles way. And then lastly, I'm going to show you this final one, which I was just, like I said, messing. And like I mentioned about, the color temperature making a big difference, right? So this is the original file, and this is unedited. This is literally straight as is, right? Nothing has changed. What I did here is pretty cool. And if you can see here, the layer says match look. And the match look is this beauty. I don't know if you can see it here.
Very impressive. That if you like you mentioned earlier, if you don't have the presets from a previous edit, you can import 15 images or show a 15 image to kind of say, hey,
yeah,
do your thing. So this is the AI portion that's taken over more and more, is it not?
Correct. And so part of this, and it's funny because when I first saw this come out, I was like, oh, this is interesting, and part of me genuinely thought, okay, well, this is the death of presets, right? There's no need anymore for presets. But then I started thinking, I'm like, okay, well, what is sort of the real case or use case scenario for this? And I thought, okay, well, prime example, we had the pandemic, right? Unfortunately, it was 4 years, let's say. Let's say shot a lookbook for a fashion client 4 years ago, 5 years ago. There's no bloody way that I'm going to know how I color graded it. I can see the image, but I don't know the values of red and green and blue or how much contrast. I mean, I'd be guessing at this point, right? Unless I took notes, which I obviously don't. But in this case, I literally can go back to, let's say those images, let's say that I shot in 2019, and literally just drag and drop up to 15 of them. And
I have actually, I like that.
It absolutely. So I'll give an example. So let's go reset tool. Okay, so here's the match look. I'm gonna get rid of this one so you can see as it is. So in this case, let's see if I can pull some images. Okay, so let's go. I don't know if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen? Okay, so here's a crazy image, right? This is really, really extreme. But let's see how this works. So this obviously here we have a lot of purples. I mean, this is gel work, right? We have some sort of white light, clean light here. We have a lot of pinks and purples and all that beautiful sort of cyberpunk type vibe. And here we have a little bit of that vibe with a little red, right, as a kicker here. So let's see how it goes as an example. And I can pull all three different images, but I just want to give an extreme example. So you just sort of drag it, drop. Okay, it does its thing. And here also just worth noting, there's things you can select and deselect. So you can select the normalize, so that way you can keep the exposure to be similar to this. Same with the white balance, light and contrast. So you can fiddle around with as little or as much as you want. Ultimately, select applies a new layer so you know that what's happening. Close this up, and then you just simply hit apply. Give it a second, it'll do the magic. And so here we go. So now in this case, you might say, oh, but it kind of looks like that, but kind of doesn't. I get that, right? But obviously, I'm using one gel in this case, and in this case, it's taking into account all those sort of things. So we can obviously adjust this, everything from the capacity of it, right, to in turn also adjust where we at. I can also up, for example, the contrast if need be, and even the colors. So if I go into, adjust, I can go into the colors, for example, here, and then start sort of pushing things and messing things. Oh, that looks awful. But I can start pushing and messing with things, right? I mean, maybe that wasn't the right example for that, but the thing is that the fact that you have a starting base to do this is, to me, the most fascinating thing of all, because it really just takes a lot of that sort of guessing game out of it. I can reset this tool.
Programs. Are you finding that with like noise reduction as well? It's another a big topic all the time. And you have the R3, which is fantastic at high ISOs, but the R5 isn't quite as good at the higher ISOs. So are you, if you're shooting in the studio, you're probably not pushing those ISOs, but for those people who are, how are you finding that the noise reduction is working on Capture One?
Yeah, so I find that the noise reduction is quite phenomenal, truthfully. And even back to the point of AI. Let's call a spade, right? I mean, AI is sort of here, right? Whether we like it or not, just like sort of the digital era, if you will, or now the mirrorless era of cameras, you sort of have to accept and adapt with the technology, or unfortunately be left behind. Now, again, back to why I like Capture One and the integration of AI is that it's an integration of it in aiding the photographer. It's not seeking to replace the photographer, which I can't say about another company, if you will, especially with their ads recently. So in this case, for example, like even this sort of match look tool, or like you said, for the noise reduction, I mean, it's some brilliant technology, to be honest with you. The fact that even nowadays, if you've shot even film, for example, I mean, that you're pushing at 1600 ISO, 3200, and it's sketchy territory. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, if you're medium format, you wouldn't go a penny over ISO 400 type of thing, and now, most cameras, I mean, you want to shoot 6400, you want to shoot 12,800, be my guest. You know what I mean? It's technology's come a long way. So in this case, I think it's good to know the technology, but it's good to sort of use it as needed, right? And in this case, for example, I mean, we can try a different file here.
He wants you to show a little bit more about the color grading in Capture One.
Yeah. Okay, so there's, I just want to see what this looks like, just out of curiosity. Let's see. So obviously very, very interesting beigey file. right? So naturally, I'm assuming everything's gonna be a little bit more exposed. Go apply the new layer. And it's funny because when you have this tool, hey, not too bad. It's almost there. It's not, exactly the same, right? But again, values are very different. But it's a good sort of starting point, right? From where we were here to there. Again, based on the values of that. And again, I can, remove things as needed. So back to color grading. Yeah. So there's three ways that you can do it. This is what I sort of demonstrated as the sort of OG way, if you will. Which where are we at? Three-way. There you go. So this is sort of the OG way of doing it, which is you're sort of doing it all sort of by eye, right? And you might say, and we can even get into where are we? We can go into, for example, layers and masks, right? As I mentioned earlier. So let's say, for example, if we're doing a color grade and you said, oh, well, I don't want, or I want to change her skin tone for argument's sake, right? So we can go, for example, face skin, body skin. Let's do both of them. You click create mask. And in the magic. Okay, so now, okay, mask. There you go. So now I just hit mask, and literally within 1 second, you gotta admit this is pretty darn cool. Right? So within 1 second. So in this case, you might say, oh, this looks good. But I definitely want to, let's get rid of the mask. So in this case, I want to, for example, lift the shadows, right? And if you notice, it's only affecting one area, right? In turn, the color grade can also affect that one area that you like as well. Back to the sort of the color grading. Matt, wrong tool. There we go. I always tend to recommend people that they use the master slider first for color balance, unless you want to do sort of a selective color. Then go into either the shadows and the highlights and adjust accordingly, right? So in this case, this is the image file. This was the initial color grade that I was doing. So the shadows, I had pulled completely down into the blues. And in the highlights, I went a little bit on the warmer end, right? And again, I can sort of finesse things and adjust everything from the opacity to whatever's needed. That's the first way of doing it. The other way also you can do color editor. And part of this as well, if I was, let's say, to get rid of this, is, for example, this skin tone tool, which I think is absolutely phenomenal, especially if you shoot people. By simply, let's go a little closer, using the skin tone tool, let's say you select here. I find this is sort of the best way. You can literally adjust things in terms of what colors it's picking up. And if I click, for example, view selected color range, it'll then, I don't know if you can see on camera, it almost mutes out everything else. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm trying to toggle it here. So that in itself allows you to literally mess around with the skin. Now, again, it's not necessarily color grade per se, but you are color grading the skin tone. So you can add a little more magenta, a little more cyan. You can tone down the saturation, for example. Let's say it's a little too hot, or warm rather. In this case, same thing. You can add, light, subtract, and then you have the uniformity side of it, which is how the skin tone from here, here, and here, this sort of area, how that sort of works and is affected. So that's the sort of OG way of doing it. The simpler way, and again, not the wrong way, is using, in this case, presets, right? Using presets, like for this, I used, where are we at? Style, there you go. So for this, for example, I simply did a black and white soft adjustment override on this for the base edit, or this under their built-in styles, and then the 5-point thing. I can also, for example, say, okay, let's get rid of this. I don't like this. And let's go. Oh, I wonder if that's because it is because of that. Hold on. So this is because of the match look from the previous one. That's very funny. That's great. Oh, where's my? There you go. So there's literally the sky's the limit, right? And then lastly is obviously sort of this match look as well, if you want to mess with it. And you can even do it whereby you do things like this, whereby it's like multiple combinations of things to get it. So from the base image to the color range. So in this case, I went a little more on the reds. Let me close this and open up. Where are we? So in this case, you can see in the color balance, right, how I messed around with this, right? Push the shadows into the red. Again, I can play around and be like, okay, I want this to be more green. So it really depends on your eyes and what makes sense. And then the highlights. Then you go into the adjustment layer. And again, you can do another thing. You can do a subject mask itself. And in this case, it's him. And I might say, okay, well, I want to now create the highlight, or let's change the color on him, right? So I can do it as specific as I want or as general as I want. And then obviously the fill layer itself, same thing. So there's literally three sort of ways of doing it. And each one will ultimately give you sort of a different look or reaction or outlook, if you will, or output. You know, and again, there's no right or wrong way. It just sort of depends on what makes sense for you and what the feel is, right? Ultimately, you know, each image here, for example, even these three, for example, it's the same image, three different color grades, obviously not including the first one, rather, so two different color grades, but they each give a different sort of feel and vibe and mood, right? So I think at the end of the day, you ultimately have to be your own critic and figure out what makes sense. But there are basics, you know, in terms of color theories, right? Use complementary colors and things like that. But experiment. This is, I mean, at the end of the day, photography is art. So experiment, mess around. There's great tools here, like that match tool. I can't speak enough about it. It's cool. You can literally spend an hour just dumping files and seeing how things work. You know, yeah, yeah, very much so. Okay, top three reasons to start off. Yeah, all right. So top three. First, simply the raw conversion is absolutely phenomenal. The raw, if you shoot raw as you should, the raw to JPEG conversion will benefit your files. They won't degrade your files. And again, I give that example. Download both of them if you have one or the other, and just do a simple sort of raw import and export as JPEG and compare. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the ease of use, right? You can set up the workflow in your workspace to how you want it to be. You can have one window, you can have 50 windows. And that's all flexible to yourself or a digital tech or an assistant. So that I love. And then lastly, it's the innovations, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I mentioned this even last week at an event here in Toronto, you know, and hopefully Adobe doesn't sue me, but I also don't think Adobe cares about Lightroom. I don't think Adobe cares about any of their softwares, Premiere Pro, Illustrator. I think Photoshop, unfortunately, is their bread and butter. That's what they love, which is great for what it is. But us photographers or creatives need a software that keeps up with us. There's a lot of cameras that are coming out. Sony, Fuji, everyone's coming with new tech, and I need a software that keeps up with the demands of modern day, right? Whether it be AI integration, whether it be firmware updates. Last thing I want is, you know, Canon sends a firmware update. I update my R3, and now my software is bricked, right? I can't use it. I don't know how the wizards do it in Capture One, but every time they're like, oh, you know, Fuji released a new camera, Sony, it's like the next day Capture One's like, oh, we've just updated. Now we support this, and I'm like, how did you do this so quickly? So those are my three sort of quick rapid fire answers, but yeah, it's a much more stable platform, right? Ultimately, and there's a reason why it's the industry leader. And a point.
Okay. And so when it comes to learning Capture One, I mean, like any other software, there is a learning curve to it. What's been sort of the most frustrating part for you, and how do you work through it?
I guess the most frustrating part, even years ago, 10 years ago, or whatever it's been now that I've been using Capture One, it's ultimately just sort of knowing, understanding sort of the ecosystem and the interface of it. Um, it works a little bit, they're all sort of similar, but it has its different, quirks or things, if you will. It looks different, of course. Um, and so I guess the only hindrance I had or obstacle was, okay, here's a new piece of software. How am I going to use it? Just like when I got the R3, right? I mean, I got the R5 first, the R3 came out later. They're both Canon products, but they shoot and act very differently, surprisingly. Um, and so what I love, and I mention this to everybody whatsoever, is check out their YouTube channel. And I kid you not, Capture One is so on top of the game when it comes to their educational side of things. You might say, "Oh, I want to know more about what Giancarlo talked about, about the the match look feature." Type in match look plus Capture One. Their tutorials are so useful that they even do live streams as well. That if you have a question that you're like, "Oh, I can't figure this out," type it in. I think it's David Grover is their technical webinar person, if you will. I don't know
You're right.
what the proper title is, instructor, if you will. But literally, I've had questions where like, oh, I don't understand this in sessions and in the early days, and he literally replied in the answers like, oh, you have to do this, and I'm like, ah, it makes sense. But they also offer like a Capture One certification program. It's an actual training program for certification, and it's free, right? Like they're not even charging; it's free. Um, so they give you all these tools, but they also give you sort of the back end of it, if you will. And if you have a question or you have an issue with the software, you can also type a message and talk to somebody. So it's a very photography centric, photography forward platform. That's the best way I can put it.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, talk about support. I mean, I can't shout out enough to Laura, who's in the chat room right now, and she is fielding all the questions very nicely and doing a great job there. So, thank you for showing up for that. That's fantastic there. Well, I guess, I mean, where can we find more of your work? Tell us just your handles there, and how do we find out more about you online?
Yeah, by all means. So I'll just share my screen because let's see if I can pull it up. I can't pull it up. Never mind. Yeah, so you can just find me on at Pawelec Photo. So Pawelec, photo Photo, or my website pawelecphoto.com. If you have any questions about Capture One, about tethering, workflow, any of those sort of things in general, by all means, feel free. I'm an open book. I don't necessarily believe in this whole gatekeeping thing, but I do believe in doing things right. And if you have a true passion for something, ask people. We also have a lot of resources nowadays, like YouTube and things like that. But photographers, we tend to be sort of a cool, awkward, quirky bunch of people. So it's like, if you ever wanted to shoot film, walk into the camera store and say, "Hey, listen, I've been hearing this cool thing called film, right, from the '80s.
We
How
stock,
do I do it?" Right?
we stock a lot of it. So you need to come out here. Actually, what you need to do, right?
100%. You let me know, and I'll take a business trip there.
You're
But
welcome.
yeah,
You're
so you
welcome.
just yeah. So follow me, and if you have any questions, by all means, feel free to ask. I'd be happy to answer whatever I can.
Well, it's cool. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on and guiding us through the ins and outs of Capture One. And I know even though we talked for a long time, we're only touching the surface of what this program's capable of doing. So much appreciate you doing that. And I want to thank Capture One for sponsoring tonight's event as well. And a reminder that if you register for this event, there is a special deal going on. Capture One's at a great price. So check that out on our website here. We have a lot more TCSTV live events coming up. So stay in touch with that. And if you like what you saw, subscribe and get that notification, hit that notification bell, and we will catch you guys again next time for another exciting event online. So thanks very much for joining us, guys. We'll take care, and we'll talk to you guys soon.